Hey everyone, it's Olivia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm going to make another IGCSE video. This is for the text Night by Alice Munro. Like with the last video, I'm just going to go through it section by section, and I'll try and cover as much as I can to do with like language or structure techniques and just anything I can think of really. First thing to say about this text is it's under the category of fiction and it's a short story, but the writer herself has mentioned that it contains autobiographical elements, which means potentially some of her own real life experience have influenced her short story, but you have to be really careful if you want to mention things like that in the exam, because unless you do your research, you can't make grand claims that it definitely is based on her real life, because when we write sometimes non-fiction or things that have happened in our past, sometimes they just kind of naturally, or even without us realizing, sometimes when we write our past events kind of come through our writing. So unless you do research and you explicitly find connections, I would say just be wary. You don't want to fall into the trap of saying, oh yeah, the writer is definitely writing about her life, because you don't know that for certain, and it is still categorized as a fictional story. I just need to get the pictures up if I can find them. And sort of the first point I could make about structure is that just by I've read through it once. It's a retrospective story, so the narrative voice, which is the narrator, is written in first person, so the first person narrator, the narrative voice, they are looking back on their life, and you can tell this because the first sentence is, when I was young, there seemed to be never childbirth or burst appendix or any other drastic physical event that did not occur simultaneously with a snowstorm. So the character is looking back on their life. And that's another thing with the whole non-fiction thing. You don't want to make the mistake of saying that Munro herself is narrating this story, because you don't know that for certain. So it's best to just say like the first person narrative voice or the first person narrator, something like that. And the fact that there's like a snowstorm is kind of really sort of setting up the kind of almost like the tone. So whenever you're reading through a story, always try to think, why has the writer chosen this particular word or this particular setting? Like, what is this going to foreshadow? What is this going to mean for the rest of the story? And even the title itself, like Night, that it can seem quite ambiguous, which means it seems quite open, but I mean the night can create a lot of sort of connotations for us, especially with darkness and things like that. The roads would be closed. There was no question of digging out of a car anyway, and some horses had to be hitched up to make their way into town to the hospital. It was just lucky that there were horses still around. In the normal course of events they would have been given up, but the war and gas rationing had changed all that, at least for the time being. So we're starting to get like context of this story. So the narrative voice is looking back on their life. Obviously, they were a child during World War II when gas rationing started to happen. And it's quite interesting, like the tone so far of this writing is very simplistic, which never be afraid to sort of point out when language is being used in a simplistic way, because it's kind of very conversational. It's what is the word I'm looking for? It's like an account. It's like the character is given their sort of personal life account. It's their life. It's a short story, but it's like a piece. It's like a snapshot of their childhood. It's a snapshot of their life. So the tone has been written. The language being used is very simplistic and easy for anyone to understand. Then this is the next paragraph. When the pain in my side struck, therefore it had to do so. When the pain in my side struck, therefore it had to do so at about 11 o'clock at night, and a blizzard had to be blowing, and since we were not stabling any horses at the moment, the neighbours' team had to be brought into action to take me to the hospital. A trip of no more than a mile and a half, but an adventure all the same. The doctor was waiting, and to nobody's surprise he prepared to take out my appendix. So once again we've got the repetition of the blizzard, and it's really important to kind of, when you're thinking about language and different words and different things in a text. Repetitions can be incredibly impactful. So if you notice with the structure there's a series of repetitions, try and think about what could the reason be for that. And I really like almost like the childish superstition that they used to have, that the time has to align with the blizzard, and because something bad is happening to them, there's this kind of superstition that's been created, this idea that, oh, if something bad happens, there has to be like a blizzard blowing. I think that's like a really sort of powerful kind of imagery that's being created. And it's also, so far, this is a very linear story, and linear just means it's in chronological order. So although they're looking at a past event, the past event they're looking at is going chronologically in order. So we're not having like massive time jumps or time skips at this point, at the beginning of the story. So that can, you can use structure techniques like that to sort of talk about how the events unfold. You can talk about, in terms of structure, you can talk about how new characters are introduced, when they're introduced, why they're being introduced, things like that. So I lay, minus my appendix, for some days looking out a hospital window at the snow sifting in a sombre way through some evergreens. I don't suppose it ever crossed my head to wonder how my father was going to pay for this distinction. I think he sold a woodlot that he had kept when he disposed of his father's farm. He would have hoped to use it for trapping or sugaring, or perhaps he felt an unmentionable nostalgia. And that part's in brackets, so that, in terms of structure for punctuation, brackets is almost like the character is sort of directly talking to you, and they're sort of revealing a really sort of personal bit of information, or kind of like their inner thoughts. And once again, we have the repetition of the snow and the idea of blizzards and snow, and it's talking about, that's personification. So the snow sifting in a sombre way through some evergreens. And if you're sombre, it means you're sort of very, very serious and very, very rigid. So the tone of this is quite, I don't know, it's almost quite, I wouldn't say mundane necessarily, but it's very, well, I guess in a way it's quite ordinary. It's like a very sort of ordinary event that is happening, but there's almost like this sort of undertone of something that's not quite positive. I don't know how to explain it. It's just, it's kind of, it seems like not much is happening, but there's just something, it's just something really interesting about the way they've personified the snow to be this kind of really sort of serious event. Then I went back to school and enjoyed being excused from physical training for longer than necessary, and one Saturday morning when my mother and I were alone in the kitchen, she told me that my appendix had been taken out in the hospital, just as I thought, but it was not the only thing removed. The doctor had seen fit to take it out while he was at it, but the main thing that concerned him was a growth. A growth, my mother said, the size of a turkey's egg. Ooh. That's really interesting, actually. So you can talk about, I think some of the ways you can earn really high marks in exams is by not just stating the obvious that you see in a text. Sometimes the things that are left unsaid are the most powerful, and they even kind of use a bit of an omission, which means like just like a blank, before they actually reveal what the doctor also discovered, and it kind of builds up that suspense and mystery, even though it's then revealed directly after, where they talk about, but it was not the only thing removed. It kind of makes you think, oh, what else is there? And sort of the way they've almost used like a metaphor for the growth to describe it as the size of a turkey's egg, it creates like a very sort of clear picture. And then that's quite a juxtaposition, because obviously a turkey's egg is something that's natural, but then you've got a growth, potentially a malignant, cancerous growth, although we don't know what the growth is, and that's unnatural because it's like a pathogen, it's a disease. So that's a really interesting piece of language to examine, like the idea of the juxtaposition between the natural, rural, rustic imagery, because it kind of sounds like if they're cut off from society, like if there's a snowstorm or blizzard, and like with childbirth and stuff, there's no way, the cars can't get through, gas rationing, so it sounds like they live in the countryside. you can kind of start to build up all the different layers. But don't worry, she said. It's all over now. The thought of cancer had never entered my head, and she never mentioned it. I don't think there could be such a revelation today without some kind of question, some probing about whether it was or it wasn't. Cancerous or benign, we would want to know at once. The only way I can explain our failure to speak of it was that there must have been a cloud around that word. So that's kind of building up the imagery again of like there's this almost like overhanging fog, and it kind of suggests that maybe this is a really painful memory for the narrator, to the narrative voice, to look back on. And it's interesting how that is starting to bring it into the present day, so they're making that further emphasizes why it's retrospective, because they're also comparing their situation to now. So like it's saying, I don't think there could be such a revelation today without some kind of question, some probing about whether it was or wasn't. But back then it's obviously quite a taboo subject still, and they're like, we don't want to talk about it. So building up all those kind of ideas. So I did not ask and wasn't told, and can only suppose it was benign or was most skillfully got rid of, for here I am today. And so little do I think that all throughout my life, when called upon to list my surgeries, I automatically say, or write only appendix. That's really powerful. So obviously you can talk about like language in terms of terminology as well, and there's a lot of medical terminology in this with like benign and appendix. It's very sort of biological language that's being used, which makes it quite clinical and it's a very serious subject matter. It's not like a light-hearted story. This is quite a heavy subject in this story, and they're saying that how on a form throughout their life, when called upon to list my surgeries, they only write appendix, and yet there's this potentially other bigger operation that they had. In the heat of early June, and this is interesting, so with structure, like I mentioned before, any changes in a text are significant. So we've had the snow, we've had the snowstorms, we've had the blizzards, we've had clouds, and now suddenly in the heat of early June, I got out of school, having made good enough marks to free me from the final examination. I looked well, I did chores around the house, I read books as usual. Nobody knew there was a thing the matter with me. And that could be seen as a foreshadow, so it's kind of setting us up for something else is going to happen. Now I have to describe the sleeping arrangements in the bedroom occupied by my sister and myself. Okay, so this is the introduction of a new character. We're now learning about the narrative voice's sister. It was a small room that could not accommodate 2 single beds side by side. So the solution was a pair of bunk beds with a ladder in place to help with whoever slept in the top bunk to climb into bed. That was me. And that's a really short, snappy sentence. So that's kind of showing us potentially the relationship that the narrative voice has with their sister. If they're sleeping on the top bunk, that could almost be seen as a symbol of dominance. So like, that was me, I'm sleeping up on the top bunk. Because kind of like the ideas of power is that the higher above someone is in comparison to someone else, stereotypically you would assume that they have more power. When I had been younger and prone to teasing, I would lift up the corner of my thin mattress and threaten to spit on my little sister lying helpless in the bunk below. So that's kind of showing that they don't have the best relationship with their little sister, and that's confirming that they are the older sister. Of course, my sister, her name was Catherine, was not really helpless. She could hide under her covers, but my game as to I think I might have cut off a bit of the text there, sorry about that, but she could hide under her covers, but my game as to watch until suffocation or curiosity drove her out, and at that moment to spit or successfully pretend to spit on her bared face, enraging her. So that's a really sort of harsh word, suffocation. Like trying to watch until suffocation. It's quite a violent sort of piece of imagery that's being created. Like so far it's been quite serious and somber, but now we're starting to get some more violent language coming through. And like the idea of spit, that's a very sort of violent action to do, to spit at someone. Even if it's just siblings, she's the older sister, the narrative voice, is clearly doing this to provoke her sister, and it's quite violent. I was too old for such fooling, certainly too old by this time. Okay, so that sounds like we've had a bit of a time skip. Oh no, we haven't, sorry. I was too old for such fooling, certainly too old by this time. So they're making the comparison now of like how, looking back, they realised that they shouldn't have been doing it, but they were. So my sister was 9 when I was 14, so that's quite a big age gap between them. The relationship between us was always unsettled. So it's really important when a narrative voice sort of tells you something explicitly. There's 2 different types. There's explicit or implicit. And this narrative, this narrator is telling us explicitly the relationship between us was always unsettled. So they've been showing us that, and now they're directly telling us that it was unsettled. When I wasn't tormenting her, teasing her in some asinine way, I think that just means like a really unpleasant way, I would take on the role of sophisticated counsellor or hair-raising storyteller. I don't mean to say I was entirely in control of her, or even that our lives were constantly intertwined. She had her own friends, her own games. There's a lot of ellipses which can help create suspense as well that are being used. In the month June, as I have said, I was free of school and left on my own, as I don't remember being in quite the same way in the other time of my growing up. I did some chores in the house, but my mother must have been well enough as yet to handle most of that work. So that's a foreshadow. So the mother is going to become sick by the sound of that, but my mother must have been well enough as yet to handle most of that work. Or perhaps we had just enough money at the time to hire what she, my mother, would call a maid, though everyone else said hired girl. That sounds quite racist, so potentially, contextually, they might have domestic help, but we don't know for certain yet. I don't remember, at any rate, having to tackle any of the jobs that piled up for me in late summers, when I fought quite willingly to maintain the decency of our house. It seems that the mysterious turkey egg must have given me some invalid status, so that I could spend part of the time wandering about like a visitor. That's a really interesting simile. So, not invalid, invalid. Invalid can relate to like a disability, or if you're ill, it's another word for saying that someone's really, really ill. So it's quite interesting how they're sort of looking back and thinking that maybe because they have this growth that they don't really know about, it's allowing them to get out of work, but they don't want to. They want to help upkeep their house. So it kind of shows a lot about their thought processes and how they've got like a lot of pride. Though not trailing any special clouds, once again we got the repetition of clouds. Though not trailing any special clouds, nobody in our family would have got away with that. It was all inward, this useless and strangeness I felt. So it shows that outwardly they're quite an explosive character in terms of the way they pick on their little sister, and potentially because of what's going on with this unknown growth that they have, maybe they are kind of trying to release their anger onto their younger sibling, but it also shows that they've got a lot of internal conflict. So never forget, you can talk about the external actions of a character compared to their internal thoughts, because it can make for really interesting analysis. It must have been just that every moment of the day was not filled up with jobs as it was summers before or after. So maybe that was the reason that I had begun to have trouble getting to sleep. At first, I think, that meant lying wide awake I was. That's a very weird sentence. With the rest of the household asleep. I would have read and got tired the usual way and turned out my light and waited. Nobody would have called out to me earlier, telling me to put out my light and get to sleep. For the first time ever, and this next bit is in brackets, and this too must have marked a special status, I was left to make up my own mind about such a thing. It took a while for the house to change from the light of day and from the household lights turned on late into the evening, leaving behind the general clatter of things to be done, hung up, finished with. It became a stranger place in which people and the work that dictated their lives fell away, the uses for everything around them fell away, all the furniture retreated into itself and no longer existed because of nobody's attention. So clatter is that's a use of onomatopoeia, and it's kind of like the text is becoming more silent once again, although I would say this text hasn't been particularly like noisy, and by that I mean whenever you read a text, there can be moments when you're reading where it's silent, and then other times they can really use onomatopoeia techniques and different techniques to make you hear things, like playing with the different senses. But so far I would say this is a very sort of visually heavy story where a character is looking back on their life, and that kind of links in with the reason why it's so visually heavy. It's because they're reminiscing about their childhood or adolescence if they're 14. But it's quite nice how we've got that introduction of clatter, but even the clatter is being left behind. You might think this was liberation. At first, perhaps it was. The freedom. So this is starting to get really short and snappy now. So when you notice that if a paragraph starts to get shorter and shorter, think about what could be the reason behind that, because that could be incredibly significant as well. And further down, we're starting to get shorter and shorter sentences. The freedom, the strangeness. But as my failure to fall asleep prolonged itself, and as it finally took hold altogether, so that almost sounds like the almost like personification of like the failure to fall asleep. It finally took hold altogether until it changed into the dawn. I became more and more disturbed by it. I started saying rhymes, then real poetry, first to make myself go under, but then hardly of my own volition. The activity seemed to mock me. I was mocking myself as the words turned into absurdity, into the silliest random speech. And then this short sentence is like a single sentence paragraph. I was not myself. So that's incredibly sort of creating a lot of sort of ominous feelings and kind of like worry, and it shows that how conflicted this character is. They know they're not themselves. I had been hearing that said of people now and then all my life without thinking what it could mean. And then this is like a rhetorical question. So who do you think you are then? I had been hearing that too, without attaching to it any real menace, just taking it as a sort of routine jeering. Think again, and once again that's a single sentence paragraph. By this time it wasn't sleep I was after. I knew mere sleep wasn't likely, maybe not even desirable. Something was taking hold of me, and it was my business, my hope to fight it off. So once again we've got quite violent, punchy verbs. So we've got like hold me, fight off, things like that. I had the sense to do that, but only barely, as it seemed. And that's interesting. It's like the positions have switched around. So she was tormenting her younger sister, but now she's the one being tormented by this growth inside of her. And that's kind of like different comparisons you make. Juxtapositions are brilliant. If you're ever stuck for comparisons, always think about juxtapositions. And juxtapositions are when two things are closely related, but they juxtapose one another. So it means they're different. So trying to think of another example, because there's loads of different ways you could describe it, but it's trying to think of an example. Juxtaposition. Think of an old GCSE text I did, like of mice and men. So you have like the juxtaposition between Candy and his old dog. They kind of juxtapose one another. They're related, but they juxtapose each other, because Candy's still hopeful that he has life in him, but his old dog is like deteriorating and is eventually put down. So it's kind of like juxtapositions like that can suggest a lot. I'm sorry if I'm repeating this bit, but I've lost where I was. I had the sense to do that, but only barely, as it seemed. Whatever it was trying to tell me to do, whatever it was trying to tell me to do things, not exactly for any reason, but just to see if such acts were possible. It was informing me that motives were not necessary. Oh, so this is getting quite ominous now, like the tone, like potentially this growth inside of her is causing her to change her behaviour. It was only necessary to give in. How strange. Not out of revenge or for any normal reason, but just because you had thought of something. And I did think of it. The more I chased the thought away, so we're getting the action and the pace is starting to really pick up now, like the sort of sentence is getting shorter, snappier, we're getting more pauses with the commas, it's starting to really build up, and you can just feel and sense that the tension is starting to rise. The more I chased the thought away, the more it came back. No vengeance, no hatred, as I have said, no reason, except something like an utterly cold, deep thought that was an urging, more of a contemplation, could take possession of me. I must not even think of it, but I did think of it. The thought was there and hanging in my mind, the thought that I could strangle my little sister, who was asleep in the bunk. Oh, that must be a typo on here. They've got bank, but I think they mean bunk. Who was asleep in the bunk below me and whom I loved more than anybody in the world. And that's really clever because that shows that earlier on when they mentioned the word suffocation, that is now actually a foreshadow to this moment where they're having this urge to strangle their sister. Oh, I might do it not for jealousy, viciousness, or anger. And that's like a list, so lists can be important and significant depending on what types of words are in this list. And like I've mentioned earlier on, even before I've got to this point, there's a lot of violent verbs or nouns that are being used. But because of madness, which could be lying right beside me there at night, and like the personification of madness, you could talk about not a savage madness either, but something that could be almost teasing. This kind of shows the character kind of how unstable they are. So it's like this blend of, they see it as teasing, but actually they're starting to head more towards like violence. And that's what I mentioned before when you use the word like spit. The character was referring to it as teasing, but most people would say you're spitting at your sibling. That's not nice. That's not a nice thing to do. A lazy, teasing, half-sluggish suggestion that seemed to have been waiting a long time. It might be saying, why not? Why not try the worst? The worst. Here in the most familiar place, the room where we had lain for all our lives and thought ourselves most safe. I might do it for no reason I or anybody could understand, except that I could not help it. The thing to do was to get myself out of that room and out of that house. I went down the rungs of the ladder and never cast a single look at my sister where she slept. Then quietly down the stairs, nobody stirring, into the kitchen where everything was so familiar too that I could not want my way without a light. The kitchen was not really locked. I'm not even sure that we possessed a key. There's a lot of repetition of the idea of possession and everything in this, which is quite interesting. It's kind of like the juxtaposition of how they're using the word possess, but they're not the ones in control. They are the ones that are being possessed. So that's quite interesting how they talk about that we possessed a key, because the character is clearly not in control, although they are at this moment because they're trying to get away from their sister. A chair was pushed under the doorknob so that anyone trying to get in would make a great clatter. A slow, careful removal of the chair could be managed without making any noise at all. After the first night, I was able to make my moves without a break, so that I could be outside, as it seemed, within a couple of smooth seconds. So that's like sibilance, which is like the technique of the S sounds of smooth seconds. So that kind of like physically represents like the smoothness of her action, like her I don't know if this narrator is a girl or not, because they haven't explicitly said, so that's another thing. You just refer to it as narrative voice, but they've like, that represents their actions of sneaking out of the house. Of course there were no street lights. We were too far from town. Everything was larger. The trees around the house were always called by their names. The beech tree, the elm tree, the oak tree. The maples always spoken of in the plural and not differentiated because they clung together. That kind of personifies the trees a bit, where how that like clung together. Now they were all intensely black. So were the white lilac tree, no longer with its blooms, and the purple lilac tree, always called lilac tree, not bushes because they had grown too big. And that's in brackets, like no longer with its blooms, so that could kind of create the idea of like decay, because when the blossoms and blooms fall off a tree, it might suggest they're heading, this might suggest that they're starting to head into autumn, potentially, because we've gone from summer and now potentially we're starting to head into autumn, or maybe time has moved on. The front and backside lawns were easy to negotiate because I had mown them myself with the idea of giving is some town like respectability. I think there might be some typos on this anthology. I don't think that makes sense, but back and forth I walked, first close to the house and then venturing here and there as I got to rely on my eyesight and could count on not bumping into the pump handle or the platform that supported the clothesline. The birds began to stir and then sing as if each of them had thought of it separately up there in the trees. They woke far earlier than I would have thought possible, but soon after those earliest starting songs there got to be a little whitening in the sky, and suddenly I would be overwhelmed with sleepiness. I went back into the house, where there was suddenly darkness everywhere, and I very properly, carefully, silently set the tilted chair back under the knob. So those are very precise adverbs: properly, carefully, silently. And went upstairs without a sound, managing doors and steps with the caution necessary. Although I seemed already half asleep, I fell into my pillow, and I woke late in our house being around 8 o'clock. I would remember everything then, but it was so absurd. The bad part of it, indeed, was so absurd that I could not get rid of it fairly easily. My brother, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting how the brother has only been mentioned now. My brother and sister had gone off to their classes in the public school, but their dishes were still on the table, a few bits of puffed rice floating in the excess milk. Absurd. When my sister got home from school, we would swing in the hammock, one of us at either end. It was in the hammock that I spent much of the days, which possibly accounted for my not getting sleep at night. And since I did not speak of my night difficulties, nobody came up with the simple information that I'd be better of getting more action during the day. So I guess through that bit you could talk about the differences between the darkness and the light. Like there's just a tiny little kind of glint of light with the whitening of the day, but then they go back into the dark house and kind of what that represents. Because they seem to have an issue with how everything is familiar, because it's almost like that's meant to be their safe place, but because they have this growth inside of them, they're not safe. My troubles returned with the night, of course. Here we go. The demons got hold of me again. I knew enough soon to get up and out of my bunk without pretending that things would get better, and that I would in fact go to sleep if I tried hard enough. I made my way as carefully out of the house as I had done before. I became able to find my way around more easily. Even the inside of the rooms became more visible to me, and yet more strange. The east wall of the kitchen had no windows in it, but it had a door opening on a stoop where we stood to hang out the heavy wet washing and haul it in when it was dry and smelling all fresh and congratulatory, from white sheets to dark, heavy overalls. At that stoop, I sometimes halted in my night walks. I never sat down, but it eased me to look toward the town, maybe just to inhale the sanity of it. All the people getting up before long, having their shops to go to, their doors to unlock, and milk bottles to take inside, their busyness. So it's quite interesting how this story is quite mundane, and it doesn't mean that it's boring, but mundane in the terms of it's a very ordinary, it's not like a fantastical story, it's a very sort of normal everyday setting. And it's interesting how the character themselves feel like, because they've got this massive worry that's kind of hanging over them, this unknown growth that's inside of them, it's almost like they're envious of other people, like how they're able just to go about their normal lives, but they can't sleep at night because they have this worry. One night, I can't say whether it could be the 20th or the 12th, or only the 8th or the 9th, that I had got up and walked, I got a sense, too late for me to change my pace, that there was somebody around the corner. There was somebody waiting there, and I could do nothing but walk right on. I would be caught if I turned back, and it would be worse that way than to be confronted. Who was it? Nobody but my father, he too sitting on the stoop looking towards town, and that improbable faint light. So that's quite interesting. This is the first introduction of the father. He was dressed in his day clothes, dark work pants, the next thing to overalls but not quite, and dark rough shirt and boots. He was smoking a cigarette, one he rolled himself, of course. Maybe the cigarette smoke altered me to another presence, though it's possible that in those days the smell of tobacco smoke was everywhere, inside buildings and out, so there was no way to notice it. So now we're starting to see there might be a parallel between her and the father. He said good morning in what might have seemed a natural way, except that there was nothing natural about it. We weren't accustomed to giving such greeting in our family. So that's kind of emphasising the point earlier of how the mother didn't tell the daughter too much about the growth, apart from the fact that it was the size of a turkey egg, and then they kind of left it and it's like very taboo. And the fact that they don't really communicate, they don't greet each other in their family, and it's kind of like, it's sort of those little red flags when you read a story, it kind of makes them pop up and you think, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Although there was nothing hostile about this, it was just thought unnecessary, I suppose, when we would see each other off and on all day. I said good morning back, and it must have been getting towards morning, or my father would not have been dressed for a day's work in that way. The sky may have been whitening, but hidden still behind the heavy trees. The birds singing too, so it's paralleling, it's like relating back to the earlier scene. I had taken to staying away from my bunk bed still later and later, even though I didn't get comfort from doing so as I had at first. The possibilities that had once inhabited only the bedroom, the bunk bed till later and later, so that's repetition, even though I didn't get comfort from doing so as yeah, I think there's some errors in this. That's repeated in the text, but I don't think it's meant to be like that. The possibilities, the bunk beds were taking up the corner everywhere. That's just, I don't understand. Sorry about that. Now that I come to think of it, why wasn't my father in his overalls? He was dressed as if he had gone into town for something. First thing in the morning, I could not continue walking. The whole rhythm of it had been broken. Having trouble sleeping, he said. My impulse was to say no, but then I thought of the difficulties of explaining that I was just walking around. So I said yes. He said that was often the case on summer nights. You go to bed tired out, and then just as you think you're falling asleep, you're wide awake. Isn't it that way? I said yes. So clearly the dad has the same problems. I knew now that he had not heard me getting up and walking around on just this one night. The person whose livestock was on the premises, whose earnings, such as they were, lay all close by, and who kept a handgun in his desk drawer, was certainly going to stir at the slightest creeping into stairs and the easiest turning of the knob. I'm not sure what conversation he meant to follow then, as regards of my being awake. He seems to have declared wakefulness to be a nuisance, but was that to be all? So this clearly shows that the father is quite a strict character. I certainly did not intend to tell him more. If he had given the slightest intimation that he knew there was more, intimation is just another word for saying a hint. If he'd even hinted that he had come here intending to hear it, I don't think he'd have got anything out of me at all. I had to break the silence out of my own will, saying that I could not sleep. I had to get out of bed and walk. Why was that? I did not know, and this is all like in short, single sentence paragraphs. Not bad dreams? No. Stupid question, he said. You wouldn't get chased out of your bed on account of good dreams. Oh, sorry. So the dad is saying that his question was stupid. Stupid question, he said. And then the next bit isn't his dialogue. It's just you wouldn't get chased out of your bed on account of good dreams. He let me wait to go on. He didn't ask anything. I meant to back off, but I kept talking. The truth was told only with the slightest modification. When I spoke of my little sister, I said that I was afraid I would hurt her. I believed that would be enough, that he would know enough of what I meant. Strangle her, I said then. I could not stop myself at all. Now I could not unsay it. I could not go back to the person I had been before. My father had heard of it. He had heard that I thought myself capable of, for no reason, strangling little Catherine in her sleep. He said, well. Then he said not to worry. He said, people have those kinds of thoughts sometimes. Okay. He said this quite seriously and without any sort of alarm or jumpy surprise. People have these kinds of thoughts or fears, if you like, but there's no real worry about it, no more than a dream, you could say. Yeah, they're like fantasies. He did not say specifically that I was in no danger of doing such a thing. He seemed more to be taking it for granted than that such a thing could not happen. As effect of the ether, he said. Ether they gave you in the hospital. So ether is like the old-fashioned version of an anaesthetic that would knock you out. And it was obviously very highly dangerous because if you breathe in too much ether, it could put you in like a coma and then you would asphyxiation, so you would choke and suffocate. No more sense than a dream. It could not happen in the way that a meteor could not hit our house. So that's an interesting way of describing it. Of course it could. Oh, and then this bit is in brackets. Of course it could, but the likelihood of it doing so put in the category of couldn't. He did not blame me, though, for thinking of it. Did not wonder at me, was what he said. There were other things he could have said. He could have questioned me further about my attitude to my little sister or my dissatisfactions with my life in general. So this, once again, kind of relates to the prophetic fallacy, which is a technique with the weather. It's very grey, it's very dreary, and this character themselves sounds quite depressed, especially when we've got towards the end of the story. They kind of have a very kind of pessimistic, not pessimistic, that's not the right word, but they've got quite a sort of they're not very optimistic. They've got a lot of weight on their shoulders and they're kind of being dragged down with it. If this were happening today, he might have made, and then once again we've got the comparison to present day. If this were happening today, he might have made an appointment for me to see a psychiatrist. There you go. So I think I hit the nail on the head there. I think that, and then this is in brackets, I think that is what I might have done for a child, a generation and an income further on. So clearly they couldn't have afforded it anyway back then, but it's kind of like this idea of like now, obviously we're lucky, although wow, the mental health system kind of has a lot of issues, but at least we're able to access them, because obviously back then mental health would have been a very taboo subject and it may not have even been officially recognised. The fact is that what he did worked as well. It set me down, but without even mockery or alarm in the world we were living in. People have thoughts they'd sooner not have. It happens in life. If you live long enough as a parent nowadays, you discover that you have made mistakes you didn't bother to know about, along with the ones you do know about all too well. You're somewhat humbled at heart, sometimes disgusted with yourself. I don't think my father felt anything like this. I do know that if I had ever taxed him with his use on me of the razor strap or his belt, he might have said something about liking or lumping it. So yeah, clearly this father is a very strict contextual father of their time. And liking it or lumping it is an idiom, which is like it's a bit like a saying or a type of phrase, a bit like a catchphrase, but it's like liking it or lumping it is something that people would say. Those strappings, then, would have stayed in his mind, if they stayed at all, as no more than necessary and adequate curbing of a mouthy child's imagining that she should rule the roost. You thought you were too smart, was what he might have given as his reason for punishments, and indeed you heard often in those times the smartness figuring as an obnoxious imp that had to have the sass beaten out of him, so that's like quite colloquial. Otherwise there was a risk of him growing up thinking he was smart, or her, as the case might be. However, on that breaking morning he gave me just what I needed to hear, and what I was even to forget about soon enough. So clearly the father does care about their child and is trying to help, but it makes you wonder what kind of thoughts they're having. And then this is the last bit. I have thought that he was maybe in his better work clothes because he had a morning appointment to go to the bank to learn. Not to his surprise, that there was no extension to his loan. He had worked as hard as he could, but the market was not going to turn around, and he had to find a new way of supporting us as paying off what we owed at the same time. Or he may have found out that there was a name for my mother's shakiness, and that it was not going to stop. Or that he was in love with an impossible woman. Never mind. From then on I could sleep. Oh, and it says in the note in the anthology next to it that the writer's mother, so actually Alice's own mother, Munro's mother, she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and that's a horrible disease, and it affects like the entire nervous system, and the person has tremors, and they can't, when it gets really, really bad, I think they can like lose their ability to walk and stuff, but it's like a nervous system disorder, and it causes like shakiness, they can't even hold a cup of tea and stuff like that. So that was kind of foreshadowed earlier on in the story. But it's really interesting, that really short, punchy sentence at the end of like, never mind, from then on I could sleep. So it's almost like the father didn't really give them advice on how to deal with it. They kind of just accepted their teenager and sort of said, well, yeah, sometimes we all have these dark thoughts, and it's just, and that's quite, it's quite, and like how it mentions like, or that he was in love with an impossible woman. So it's really sad how if the mother is becoming very sick, that's probably putting a lot of pressure on the father, and potentially the father is having similar thoughts. Maybe the father themselves was lying in bed at night thinking how he could strangle his ailing wife, like the sister imagined she could strangle her little sister. So I think it's a very powerful short story, and I really like the use of night, of how like night, they can't sleep at night, but that's kind of the time they can escape and just go outside until the light comes again. So I think there's a lot you could talk about with this short story. If you have any questions or want me to go over anything, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll also put my tutor email in the description. Anyway, I hope this helps in some way, and